Siobhan Huggins. If you don't know her now, you will know her very soon. She is a rising star because she is very intellectually gifted. She brings much needed rationality and perspective to the way we think about the functioning of the human body. And her vision of grassroots citizen science is truly inspirational. Please welcome Siobhan Huggins.
Hello. So my name is Siobhan Huggins, if it wasn't clear from the spelling. And for nearly a year, I've had the joy and honor of working full-time with Dave Feldman. I spend most of my time at cholesterolcode.com, where I research cholesterol metabolism as well as the immune system, and occasionally do experiments that help me and others better understand how these systems work. Before I got started, I wanted to mention any conflicts of interest, and the number one is Cholesterol Code may be offering direct-to-consumer lab ordering in the future, so I wanted to make that clear here. But as a side note, if you can get testing through insurance for cheaper or even for free, I would highly recommend you stick with that. I've also been following a primarily carnivorous diet since October of 2017, and thus may unintentionally show some bias. So when Amber asked if I wanted to speak at this event, I immediately started to think about what I wanted to share with the people here. While I could have discussed something like cholesterol, I felt that this would have resulted in something that was more relevant to low-carbers in general and not specifically to carnivores. I also admittedly hadn't really seen much research on carnivorous humans and lipid metabolism anyway, so there wouldn't have been much point. In fact, I went carnivore in part because I didn't know what would happen. It was largely a mystery to me, but I like mysteries and I wanted to find out. I started from a ketogenic diet, but I thought it couldn't be too different. But before that, to give a little bit of context, before I started a ketogenic diet, I looked like this. Not only was I very overweight, but I felt, admittedly, really horrible. And despite multiple attempts at caloric restriction, which inevitably works anytime you try it, it didn't for me, and my weight wouldn't budge. But thanks to my mom, who I'm extremely grateful for, in August of 2016, I started a ketogenic diet, and about a year later, I looked like this. So besides the visual changes, most important to me, similar to what Michaela has stated, I also experienced a remission of the depression that I'd been experiencing since I was about 11 years old. Now, about a year into this, I decided to try out carnivore for a month, partially due to Amber and the research that she presented. And I mostly just wanted to see what would happen. And now I obviously look like this. Now, surprisingly, beyond some additional weight loss, I also experienced benefits above what I had with a ketogenic diet. For example, my mood improved, and my skin and hair also improved. And my appetite, as Dave mentioned, became clear, where it had been somewhat ambiguous before. And, best of all, I now truly enjoy what I eat, which was definitely not true before. Now, I do have one small regret in that because I had only intended to try carnivore for a short amount of time, I actually hadn't got a lot of baseline testing done. I hadn't done body composition scans or anything like that. But this is actually something I hear from people pretty often. They start out intending to try carnivore for a week or a month, and then get caught in the carnivore trap, unwilling to stop because they enjoy the benefits of carnivore so much. So my suggestion to people who are considering trying a carnivorous diet is get all the baseline testing, all of it, every single test you can think of that you could possibly want, because this may be your last opportunity. Now, as I was settling into carnivore, I also did a few experiments alongside Dave, as I mentioned a bit ago. Now, while working on these experiments, I noticed it wasn't uncommon for people to say that they wanted to help our research, but no one could possibly do what Dave and I were doing. most of the points seem to be working off the idea that you have to test as frequently and as extensively as Dave and I do for the results to have value. And admittedly, that is a very, very tall order, I will admit that. While it is true that the heavy-duty experiments can be very useful, as Dave has shown, there are definitely benefits from lab testing that's only done maybe once a year, or other types of information, as Sean mentioned, that don't really require any testing at all. The benefit to it being easier and cheaper than ever to do testing is that you can pick the level of testing that fits you. You certainly can get all the gadgets available, Dave, to the point where labeling yourself as a cyborg would be more or less accurate, but it isn't necessary. After all, the information from annual blood work that's shared back to us or other people can be used to spot patterns within the community. One of the most well-known profiles at this point is the lean mass hyperresponder, and I want to emphasize here that this is a profile that probably would never have been spotted unless this was being shared back. These are people with extremely high cholesterol. They're lean, mean, fat-burning machines, and especially with the current guidelines, they likely would have been said they have a genetic condition, and it would have stopped there. I'll get back to them later, though. And other trends have come to light as well, some of which I'll expand upon in a little bit. All of this data shared back has allowed us to compile possible issues people may come across on ketogenic or carnivorous diets, and troubleshooting tips for people that need them, all based off of information we got back from you guys, the community. In fact, because so many people would post their labs on cholesterol code, Dave and I were able to get a pretty good sense of what was normal for low-carbers or carnivores and what certain patterns indicated about the person who was coming from. For example, how lean they are, how active they are, etc. And sometimes Dave and I would joke that this was sort of like being in the Matrix, with all the numbers scrolling by in the form of lipid panels. Given this context, when something came up that was very obviously outside the norm, like high triglycerides, very high triglycerides in some cases, in people who were otherwise following the standard recommendations, fasting for 12 to 14 hours, etc., we were able to realize pretty quickly that this was not normal based off of the information we'd seen previously, and we had the awesome opportunity to ask people about what they were doing, to try and figure out what was going on. Over time, this one anecdote developed into a dozen people saying the same thing, a pattern, and we were able to identify a likely suspect. And I apologize in advance because this tends to upset some people. The suspect was habitual coffee consumption. Although not everyone who drinks coffee has this problem. You may have noticed I've been drinking coffee a lot today, and I don't have this problem. My triglycerides are pretty much always under 100 unless there's some confounding factor. But it was a common theme among these people, and for that reason, it was officially added to our top suspect list for low carbers with high triglycerides in this post. Now, once this was made more widely public, even more people were able to test this out for us and report back on whether it worked for them or not. In quite a few cases, when coffee was removed for 2 weeks, their triglycerides dropped significantly, in one case going from 296 milligrams per deciliter to 50, where under 100 is normal. So that's pretty significant in my eyes. Now, after these reports came back and we were like, okay, yeah, we're pretty sure it's coffee at this point, the more intensive testing came in. This is actually a guest post. This was not from me or Dave. It's actually from Sean. So thank you, Sean, for doing this. And these results that he found were posted on Cholesterol Code, showing that it was, in fact, coffee alone that was doing this. You can see he's moving his levels up and down from drinking or not drinking coffee consistently. So even though we don't know if high triglycerides in this situation is harmful in itself, at the very least, people who are having this issue have a good way to test if that's what it is, and they can decide for themselves if they're comfortable with this or not. At the same time that this was going on, I noticed that there were many in the carnivore sphere who were rejecting even getting routine blood work done. I recently did a poll on Twitter to see what the typical reasoning was because I was curious. And as you can see, it seemed a big reason was that many people felt that the results wouldn't change anything that they were doing for one reason or another. So they didn't see the point. I also got the impression that some felt that because so much had been gotten wrong about health and nutrition in the past, that it was very likely that what we consider a healthy lab result, that could be wrong too. That's a fair point. Now, I can understand this, as I felt similarly when I watched the documentary Fathead pretty early into a ketogenic diet. Admittedly, it was unsettling, because I realized that a lot of the advice I had been given had been misleading and probably directly impacted my health in a negative way. I was left not knowing whether other recommendations were likewise untrustworthy. But even if this is true, I do think it's possible to find out which parts are wrong and build on what we have left with data from carnivores so that we can make something for ourselves and others that will help us in the long run. But there's another problem. It seemed it wasn't uncommon for carnivores to see their doctor and get berated or pressured into taking medication that they weren't comfortable with. Now, this seemed to be either due to some lab results that they got back or simply on principle. Eat your vegetables. You can't do this, you'll die. As a result, some decided not to get further testing just to avoid the conflict. And this is completely understandable, don't get me wrong. Because these very same people were often people who put life-ruining diseases into remission. And then they were getting told that what they were doing was unsustainable or unhealthy in the long term. And they're coming from this position of, how is this unhealthy if this is the best I've ever felt? So I can understand that. But if your doctor is at least willing to work with you in some capacity, even with some disagreements, it's worth pointing out that many of the low-carb doctors I've talked to, some of the carnivore doctors I've talked to as well, have said that their perspective was changed by patients sharing their successes and sharing how they got those successes in the first place. So it's possible you could do the same for yours. Additionally, for the keto or carnivore-friendly doctors in the audience, I have something for you as well. I heard from a low-carb-friendly doctor on Twitter that they had an elderly patient under their care with a few health issues. And they felt that, low-carb might help them. But they avoided telling the patient that because they felt that the patient wouldn't be interested, wouldn't be able to do it. They're maybe too elderly to really change their ways. And so they didn't. Now, they got a surprise when the patient came back later, pretty miffed, because they had sought out this information themselves and tried it with great success. And, they were asking, why didn't you tell me? So this is something to consider as well for if you're in a comfortable enough place to suggest carnivore, even if you think the patient might not be interested, all they really need is to understand that this is a possible option that could work for them, as long as you're very clear about where the current evidence stands. This is based on anecdotes. We don't know for sure. This might not work. All they need to know is that it is possible, and then they can decide for themselves. This is a way that doctors and patients can work together in a partnership. Patients can report back on what works for them, and doctors can use this information and share it with other patients to help everyone. And, in fact, the low-carb or carnivore doctors can share back information on what they see from their patients in general terms about what is normal, what stands out as weird, and then we can investigate further from there. Now, personally, I'll admit that I was actually pleasantly surprised by my doctor. I was open about being on a plant-free diet, and he pretty much just shrugged and looked at the stack of lab reports that I had brought in, and said that as long as I continued to keep a close eye out for any issues, he didn't really have an issue with it. Additionally, I will admit he's not 100% on board, but even if this is the case, I'm aware that there's a possibility that there may be some pre-existing damage that I may have from my previous diet. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. That may not appear until much later on. And there's also, of course, things that may not be related to diet at all. I've certainly seen this type of thing happen to other low-carbers where they had health issues not related to diet. And for that reason, I still see my doctor even though I order all of my labs independently, just to make sure he can help me catch these things if they do appear. But even if your doctor isn't understanding of or tolerant of your lifestyle, if you feel better having the option of having someone you can talk to, there are definitely other options. I know we had the doctors in the audience raise their hand before, but could you please do that again? Yeah, those are other options. There are also online tools that can help you find doctors in your area. Some do remote consultation as well if there's not one, and you can use the doctors here to network. They tend to all seem to talk to each other for some reason, just to see if there's someone that's not on the list. I can understand that people are struggling with carnivore in general, though, as things do seem to be more complicated than they appeared at first glance. There's evidence to suggest that what we consider normal or high risk when it comes to things like cholesterol, big surprise, may depend on context, meaning that in a population-based study where you can't as easily control for context, it makes it extremely difficult to know if this is a marker that's high risk for everyone or only for a subpopulation of people, for example, people who are already unhealthy, or maybe it's a sign of them being unhealthy in that context, and we just don't know. For example, I grew up with the idea that high cholesterol is bad. No questions asked, get it down as soon as possible, no matter who you are. But then I see studies like this one, and it essentially says if the context, that is if you're a woman, which I happen to be, it doesn't appear to be so straightforward. Or looking at it another way, it could be extremely straightforward, just in the opposite way that we assumed. I've certainly also seen plenty of evidence, including in this conference, that carnivorous diets are a different context as well. But if that is the case, in what way? And we don't know. We have a lot of excellent people trying to figure this out, though, and with data coming directly from carnivores, this research can only improve. And we can begin to figure out what a healthy urban carnivore looks like. I specify urban because although there are hints to be found in indigenous populations who are carnivore, there are possible issues with basing all of our understanding off of them alone. Now, I've seen criticism levied against those using indigenous societies that eat high-carb diets as examples of what we should be eating, with the explanation that, their lifestyle's significantly different than ours. For example, their food quality may differ, I wouldn't doubt that one, as well as light exposure and other factors, including previous health problems. People who have undergone damage from evolutionarily inappropriate diets, for example, may react very differently to the same diet as someone who's been following that diet for their entire lives. But all of these same criticisms could be used against using exclusively indigenous carnivorous populations as our role model of what normal looks like. This isn't to say that information from them is unusable, but ideally we would also be looking at information from people that live similar lifestyles to us as well. But there's another problem, because the studies revolving around the average American, for example, end up gathering data from people on high-carb diets, obviously not helpful. A large number of these people are also not metabolically healthy, extremely not helpful. Unfortunately, this can make associations between food and health all the more complicated, because they could be clouded by things like non-compliers. For example, people who eat more red meat in the average American lifestyle are also more likely to smoke and drink excessive alcohol and eat things that we also consider typically unhealthy, like donuts and Tim Tams if you're in Australia, and vice versa. To control for these issues, I imagine it would help to build off of existing research, as we saw here, and also include data from self-experimentation, as we saw from Dave's. This will help us identify how we differ from other groups and make sure we handle these differences accordingly if we also include data from the population we're trying to study, us. If we don't, we run into problems of applying tests inappropriately without realizing the consequences. For example, I see carnivorous women getting an oral glucose tolerance test while pregnant at the recommendation of their well-meaning doctor. This is used to determine if they have gestational diabetes, but the problem is, if you're coming from an extremely low-carb diet, you're likely to fail the test, and then you'll be labeled diabetic. This is possibly because of the sugar-sparing aspect of low-carb diets. Your muscles will essentially reject the sugar coming in order to spare it for other tissue that needs it, like the brain or red blood cells. This is an adaptive response. This may be fine if the woman in question is aware that this may be an issue, but if she's not, and they're caught unaware, it can cause a lot of stress and undue conflict that could have been avoided, especially because they will be pressured to follow a standard diabetic diet and follow the guidelines throughout the pregnancy. And who wants to deal with that? I don't. Another example of potential misdiagnosis as carnivorous diets is something that's been mentioned a couple times. Low T3 being confused for hypothyroidism, even if the person in question is asymptomatic. This means that if carnivores aren't aware that this is a possibility and potentially adaptive, they could attempt to treat it, supplying extra T3 to try and fix the problem. But as Amber mentioned, if you have high T3 and a low glucose diet, then this may result in muscle wasting, creating a problem where there may not have been one in the first place. Gathering information from carnivores to establish what is normal could help identify these differences and prevent issues like this. Over the long term, the data could also be collected to be used to determine if people on carnivorous diets develop things like heart disease and cancer at abnormal rates, as would be expected by what we hear about the demons of red meat and saturated fat. As mentioned before, the studies where these concerns originate from have many issues. So examining people who only eat these things may shed a little light on the situation over the long term. Granted, this type of self-tracking does come with its own set of problems. For example, many people who seek out carnivorous diets, like Michaela and many of the other people here, are trying to fix pre-existing problems. This could mean that overall they're living an abnormally healthy lifestyle to try and manage that, trying to cover all factors to keep things under control. And on the other hand, their pre-existing conditions could have caused damage that they don't even realize that could result in problems even after they've changed their diet and result in higher risk than we might expect. But even if this is the case, if animal products are as dangerous as we're told they are, we should still be seeing above average rates of these diseases comparing to other generally health-conscious people. They've done this with vegetarian studies, by the way. And the other issue, the pre-existing issue, the pre-existing damage can be captured through baseline lab work, including calcium scans, if you're into that. Shortly before or close to when people start carnivory, and even just noting down pre-existing conditions so we can be aware. I've begun to see this community-focused learning pop up in other groups as well. One example being the Lean Mass Hyperresponder Facebook group. As I mentioned earlier, lean mass hyperresponders are one of the profiles that we've seen in the low-carb community, and it's pretty well summed up here. This has led to a group of lean mass hyperresponders, spectators, critics, and others all gathering information in the group and sharing it there, primarily to discuss the profile and share studies and other information on it. Most of the information being shared from the actual people is lab work from annual labs, so nothing high intensive or anything like that, but also calcium scores and really whatever else people want to feel like getting. I've also noticed that some people in the group, some seem to be more focused on how they feel. I feel great, this is the best I've ever felt. While some are more concerned about understanding their lab results and why they're different and what it means. And because the science on the profile is still in its infancy, Dave and I both try to encourage people to do what they're comfortable with in regards to staying with the profile or moving away from it. As a result, those who are more focused on their test results can check in with the group and see if something abnormal that they found is actually common throughout the profile. And if it turns out that it is, a lot of the times they just wanted to know and they're comfortable with it past that point. Now, admittedly, this could just mean that whatever abnormality it was could be a widespread issue throughout the group, and we just don't know that yet. But all we're really trying to do is provide an environment where people can be informed. This is their decision, not ours. This can also mean that if something is spotted that isn't normal among the others, they can quickly identify this and try to investigate further to determine what the cause is. I've also seen this happen in other groups, especially low-carb groups, and on a few occasions, it resulted in catching a problem very early that could have developed into a serious issue. The group also has the benefit, yes, I did say benefit, of some members, of having some members who think the profile may be detrimental in the long term. And they share studies to support their opinion. Dave and I actually try to encourage the sharing of these opinions as long as they're respectful, as in the end, this gives us more things to look for in case we're wrong, which is always awesome. And it also helps us make sure we don't fall prey to the mistake of only circulating like-minded ideas. The group is about learning, and the best way to learn is to invite criticism and genuinely look at it and try to figure out if they're right. Now, this is also similar to the Type 1 Grit group, which is a group focused around using low carb to help manage Type 1 diabetes. And they actually retroactively collected their information and published it as a paper. And I highlight that not because as soon as something is published in a paper, it's sanctified and holy or whatever. It's because publishing something in a paper is one way to collect information, show your work, and make it hopefully understandable for other people. This means this is something that's easily shareable. You know, you can cite your source that this works. So that's why I mentioned that. This same formula could be used in other groups, including lean mass hyperresponders, including carnivores, but only if the information is collected, shared, and discussed, the good and the bad. I do tend to focus a lot on blood tests, but I want to make sure I emphasize that even if you're unable or completely uninterested in getting blood work done, there's still other information that'll be useful to gather moving forward. Honestly, sharing the downsides of carnivorous diets, for example, or just weird things you experience, like pruning fingers, can help collect problems we come across, and it'll be helpful to people who are considering carnivore so that they can know what they're in for. Sometimes it genuinely does help just to know, what might happen, and that what you're experiencing is normal and that it'll eventually pass. I have seen in some other nutrition communities that people who present with problems will be told that they're doing the diet wrong, or they're not trying hard enough, or they're making the group as a whole look bad to outsiders, and then they'll be dismissed. But if we encourage people who share their problems, we can collect this information, and we can try to figure out what's causing it so we can help resolve or prevent it for people moving forward. Prevent that in the first place, which is always great. In fact, it'd be incredibly useful to gather information from people who tried carnivore and hated it, or just felt it wasn't right for them, and see what their reasoning was. What was the straw that broke the camel's back? And share that with people who maybe they will find that a significant concern. It's all useful. And this is something that I've seen Amber share on Twitter, as well as Rafi from Nutrita, who's actually here. I want to help collect this information because you may not know this, but modern carnivore is still in its infancy and composed entirely of early adopters at this point. These are people who see potential in something far before the concept becomes widespread. We've jumped into something before there are randomized controlled trials, guidelines, or how-to books, and that's awesome, but it's not going to be everyone. The early adopters of the carnivorous diet tried it due to maybe curiosity or desperation or rebelliousness, or sometimes just because they really liked steak and thought it sounded cool. And these people, I've noticed, are quite often happy relying on how they feel. But there are also many who are too hesitant to try it or to continue it without more information being made available, just like we also see in the Lean Mass Hyperresponder Facebook group. I saw the same thing occurring with ketogenic diets and fasting, where it wasn't until people started publishing its effectiveness for diabetes reversal that people around me seriously started to consider it as an option. This data was made easily readable, easily shareable, and suddenly it's like, okay, maybe this is a thing I can try. Sometimes people won't touch anything until it's easily readable and understandable and there's data behind it. And that's okay, and I want to help those people if I can. Modern carnivory is a largely unexplored territory, granted. So I definitely do agree with the statement that Amber made here, that carnivores are pioneers. For low-carb diets, at the very least, there is newer research, like what we see from Virta Health, Volek and Finney, and others, which examine low-carb diets in a modern context with people from many different circumstances. Most of the information we have on carnivorous societies are examining carnivores who've been carnivore their entire life. We have no way of knowing what to expect from someone who's undergone severe metabolic damage trying to try the diet, what they should expect, what it'll look like, anything like that, or what strategies may be useful for them, as has been mentioned before, although we're learning. The people applying carnivorous lifestyles to a much different environment than we see in other studies are pioneers. Not because these frontiers didn't exist before. There are people who've been doing this longer than anybody here has been alive. But just like real-world pioneers who explored oceans that may have been explored before, it wasn't the exploring part that was important. It was their mapping of the previously undocumented and sharing that back with the people who need the security of directions before venturing out. The sad truth is, it's very unlikely that carnivorous diets will get much, if any, mainstream research attention in the coming years. And by RCTs here, I mean even short term. I just don't see funding for that happening anytime soon. If we wait for anyone else to do this, we'll end up looking like that. The longer people go without access to the information they need in the form that they need it in, the longer they go without possibly life-changing solutions, even if the solution itself is really simple. But if quality long-term data is what people need to try carnivore and see if it works for them, then I would like to help these people in any way I can, along with anyone else who's interested in helping with this, with the reassurance that it does not have to be difficult or time-consuming or expensive or invasive, although it may end up needing to eat a lot of meat. The examples of Virta Health and IDM and Type 1 Grit and others show that we no longer need to rely only on food frequency questionnaires and associational studies focusing on people on high-carb diets. We just don't need to do it anymore, although we can, and it can help us form hypotheses and other things to look more into. We can instead focus on gathering high-quality information from our own population so we can help move this forward and help people who need our help themselves. Lastly, I wanted to thank Amber for allowing me to have the opportunity to be at this conference and learn from everyone here, and I don't just mean the speakers, and also the patrons and cholesterol code members who also helped me get here. Thank you.